Hi, my name's Connor Malley, and I'm here today to talk to you about LSD. Now, you may be wondering what LSD stands for, but it stands for lysergic acid dilithamide, which is kind of its confusing chemical term. LSD, otherwise known as acid, is usually taken in tab form. So what really happens when you take LSD? When you take LSD, it affects the neurotransmitters in your brain. Neurotransmitters are chemicals located and released in the brain to allow an impulse from one nerve cell to pass to another nerve cell. Specifically, LSD affects the serotonin neuroreceptor and the dopamine neuroreceptor in your brain. Serotonin helps with mood regulation, memory, sleep, sexual function, bone health, and blood clotting, along with other roles in the central nervous system, while dopamine plays an increasing role in movement, memory, pleasurable reward, behavior, and cognition, as well as attention. Until recently, it was unclear how LSD exactly affected the brain. That is until Dr. Rob Carhart Harris conducted an experiment using 20 volunteers where half of them received a placebo, or a harmless pill, and the other half received 75 micrograms of LSD. Their brain activity was then studied using an fMRI, or a functional magnetic resonance machine. This machine detects changes in blood flow within the brain. This is what the brain activity of the placebo group looked like. As you can see, there is some red, which indicates blood movement, but not a whole lot. While this is the brain activity of the LSD group. As you can see, the blood activity is a lot more prominent in this example. While this may help you understand what exactly goes on in your brain when you take LSD, let's now talk about what happens to your overall body when you take LSD. When you first take a tab of LSD, you usually won't feel the effects of the LSD for about 20 to 90 minutes. Since LSD is a hallucinogenic, it affects you both mentally and physically. Physical effects of LSD can include sweating, dehydration, increased body temperature, and increased heart rate. Now, it's important to note that these are just some of the most common side effects when taking LSD. Every single person will have a different experience when they take a hallucinogenic. Most common psychological effects are hallucinations, sensory distortion, paranoia, and euphoria. Most common of these psychological effects, which many people will say that they have when they take LSD, is hallucinations. Why is there a moth attacking me? LSD is a very complex drug, and the specifics on how it affects neurotransmission is still being studied. To understand the full effects of LSD, we first need to understand how neurotransmission. Neurons communicate with one another at junctions that are called synapses. At the synapses, this is when a neuron can send a message to a targeted neuron or another cell. Most synapses in our brain communicate through electrical waves that pass through cells to cell. This electrical charge, otherwise known as an action potential, triggers the presynaptic neuron to release neurotransmitters. These neurotransmitters are molecules that bind to receptors on the postsynaptic cell and make it more or less likely to fire an action potential. Essentially, postsynaptic neurons are nerve cells that receive electric pulses from your brain after they pass through the synapses. If a pulse is strong enough, this transmission received can result in an action. If an action potential is strong enough received in the postsynaptic neuron, then this can result in an action such as moving your leg or picking up your phone. Now, there are some instances where LSD activates shut down serotonin receptors or synapses. This means that your serotonin neurotransmitter is binding to its receptor on the postsynaptic neuron, causing false activation. This can cause involuntary actions to occur. However, there are other instances where LSD blocks serotonin receptors that are active from delaying messages. This means that LSD is not allowing your serotonin neurotransmitter to bind with its receptor on the postsynaptic neuron, which can cause a failure of action, such as falling down the stairs or not walking correctly. Essentially, LSD just messes with your serotonin receptors, and we can't really predict if it's going to cause a failure of action or an involuntary action. Now, many people see that since you're ingesting LSD rather than inhaling it or snorting it, you are actually saving your brain, since ingesting a drug usually means that there is a less percentage of that drug in your brain. But since a majority of your serotonin receptors are actually in your stomach to help regulate digestive patterns, LSD can affect a user more than anticipated. Interesting thing about LSD is it's actually considered not addictive or not compulsive for use. One thought on why LSD isn't as addictive as some other drugs is because of this graph right here. The mind is lit up so much that constant and heavy use of LSD is physically and mentally tolling on the user. It's also considered not as addictive as some other drugs because the human body actually builds a relatively quick tolerance to LSD. This requires a lot of users to increase their doses after a few days of reuse. Please do not try this at home. Now, even though LSD is not considered technically addictive, there are some very bad long-term effects that can happen from too much LSD. The most common of these is hallucinogen persisting perception disorder, or sometimes known as flashbacks. These flashbacks can usually be associated with a bad trip, and oftentimes these flashbacks take you back to the state that you were in during a psychedelic experience. Although there are no neurological damages that are associated with this disorder, there are a lot of lifestyle changes that can be very damaging to a person who has taken LSD. There was a case where a 47-year-old male who had taken LSD when he was in high school received flashbacks and had sensory overload at the time. Experienced for multiple weeks constant hallucinations and panic attacks, especially with lights that were not actually there. In conclusion, although LSD might be linked to some people for religious experiences or spiritual awakenings, it's not a drug you really want to be messing around with too much. The overall effect that LSD has on your body can really throw off the overall balance. By affecting your serotonin receptors, it disarrays your central nervous system and allows for injuries to take place. And when LSD attacks your dopamine receptors, it can distort your reality and make things less pleasurable for you. You might think that you can see the world through a spiritual disconnection from your own body, but in all reality, all you're doing is distorting your mind and making the actual reality around you more gloomy.